Hi, I'm Tim Janisewski. Welcome to today's edition of Spotlight Matthew. We are in the 7th chapter of the Gospel at the end section of the greatest of all time sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, looking at verses 13 through 27. And they have to do with the question of, is Christianity inclusive or is it exclusive? And as we saw in our last devotional, in some ways it's very inclusive, because the gospel is to be preached and proclaimed to all people in all places at all times. And if it ever tries to be exclusive, refusing to preach the gospel in all places to all people at all times, then it is committing a sin and indeed not living up to the great commandment. And yet we saw that Christianity in its message itself is very exclusive. That message is singular. It is not plural. It does not affirm that all paths lead to the top of the salvation mountain. No, it says that only one path can lead us to the summit of salvation, and that is the path that leads to Jesus Christ. And we saw from yesterday that Jesus says to beware of those who preach an open and broad salvation inclusivism. They are false prophets bringing a false message that leads to a wide gate and a wide way of destruction. He even says, be careful of those who practice an inclusive religion, even though it may be in the church, even though it may look very religious. In the end of the day, it is a worker of lawlessness, and Jesus says, I never knew you. Strong words. Well, we want to turn today and ask for the positive side of this equation. What indeed is the way that leads through the narrow path to the narrow gate and life now and life forevermore? And to pick that up, the characteristics of this exclusive way that is inclusively preached to all people, let's read again from chapter 7, verses 13 through 27. I'm going to pick up actually at verse 17, on that. Jesus says, so every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them or recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rains fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, but it did not fall, because it was founded upon the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. And with those words, Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount. Well, what are the characteristics of a person who is bound on the narrow way through that small gate that only a few will enter through because it is hard, yet it leads to God's full forever life, beginning right here and now and extending into all eternity? Well, I think we can pick out 4 characteristics from this teaching of Jesus. First of all, we read in verse 20, thus you will recognize them by their fruits. The first characteristic of someone going through the narrow way is the fruit that they bear in their lives. And Jesus said the fruit that we are to bear is the fruit that God will give us, a fruit of hearing the voice of Jesus. When he calls us, we follow him. We are teachable under the hand of Jesus. He tells us to do what he would have us do, and we gladly obey. We have a passion and a hunger for righteousness, and we want to be filled with it. We bear those characteristics that Jesus mentions in the Beatitudes, that we are poor in spirit, that we mourn our sin, that we are meek or humble, that we hunger and thirst after righteousness. What are the characteristics of those who are bearing the good fruit for Jesus? Indeed, we are to be people who are merciful. We are to have a pure heart. We are to be peacemakers. We are to be those who are willing to be persecuted for the sake of following Jesus Christ. Those are the kinds of good fruits that we are to be bearing if we are following in the narrow path. That's the first characteristic. By our fruit we will be known. The second characteristic is found in verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but who will? The one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Are we people who hunger and thirst and desire to do the will of God and nothing else? Is our life about pursuing the will of God, or is our Christianity actually about using our faith to pursue a better life, a good life, a life that is the one that we would hope and long for? What's first, the will of God or our own will? It goes back to Jesus' teaching about mammon, about stuff. You cannot serve two masters, for you will love one and hate the other. You'll be passionate about one but despise the other. You can't serve both God and stuff. And Jesus is saying the ultimate arbiter of whether we're serving God or stuff is whose will be done. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in my life as it is in heaven, is the mark of the narrow way. So fruitfulness, pursuing the will of God. Jesus gives us a third marker in this passage today, and we find it in verse 23. Verse 23, I will declare to them, I never knew you, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Do we know Jesus? Do we actually have a personal relationship with God through our Savior, Jesus Christ? Knowing you, Jesus, there is no greater thing. There's no greater experience in our life. There's no more important thing. It's good for us to know our family members, to know our friends, to know our spouses if we are married. We cannot imagine having a life without relationship. We're relational beings. But the greatest of all relationships is the one that we are to have with Jesus Christ. And we don't want to get to that final judgment day only to hear that Jesus says, oh, you were very religious, you prophesied, you cast out demons, you did mighty works, you served on the deacon board, you were an elder, you went on the missions trip, you were active in worship on every Sunday morning, you taught Sunday school to third graders, but I never knew you. By all means, do those good works, but never apart from actually knowing Jesus. There is no greater thing, and so we must ask ourselves, do we know the one whom we call Lord, Lord? It's at the center and the heart of our Christian faith. And then fourth and finally, Jesus says the mark of someone who is indeed following the narrow path that leads to life is anyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who is building his or her life upon the rock. The waters rise, the storm blows, and yet they are not shaken because their life is built upon the very word of Jesus. But the one who builds on something other than the word of Jesus is like that building upon the sand, and the winds rise and the waves rise and the winds blow, and great is the crash that is come to it, the way of destruction. Isn't it sobering too that Jesus says that whether you will enter by the narrow way depends upon whether he knows you and you know him, whether you hear and obey his words or not? Jesus indeed seems to be rather egotistical and self-centered in saying there is only a narrow way. It's one way, and I am that way. Not my teaching is that way. I am not giving you suggestions or life wisdom or recommendations. I am telling you that I, Jesus Christ, am that very way. And to know me is to know the narrow way. To do what I say is to follow the narrow way. To do what I command is to walk in the will of God. And if indeed you do follow me, you will bear good fruit. Jesus is exclusive, and his center of exclusivity is himself. And with that Jesus, brings an end to the greatest sermon of all time, the Sermon on the Mount. Go back and read through these verses for today and consider these aspects in your own life. Am I bearing Jesus' fruit? Am I hungry for the will of God found in Jesus Christ? Do I personally know Jesus, my Savior and Lord? And am I passionately obeying the word that he gives me, that my life might be founded upon the solid rock of Jesus Christ, where I take my stand, because all other ground is sinking sand. That's our devotional for today. Thanks always for being with us. Like us on Facebook, share us with others, and check us out at spotlightgoodnews.com. And we'll talk to you next time.